The scent of copper mingles with pine needles as Alpha King Theron Blackmane crawls through the snow, his 3 newborn pups whimpering weakly against his bloody chest, while the howls of his former pack echo through the frozen forest behind him. Each breath burns like fire in his lungs. The snow beneath him turns crimson as he drags himself forward, one trembling hand pressed against the tiny bundles tucked inside his torn jacket. His pups, barely 3 days old, mewl softly, their small bodies growing colder by the minute. Keep moving. Just keep moving. The wind cuts through the trees like claws, and somewhere behind him, the hunting party's howls grow fainter. Good. Maybe they think he's already dead. Maybe they'll give up. His left leg gives out, sending him face first into a snowdrift. The metallic taste of blood fills his mouth as he spits out pine needles and ice. When he looks down, the gash across his ribs has torn open again, soaking through the makeshift bandage he'd fashioned from his shirt. "Shoo," he whispers to the pups as they begin to cry. "Daddy's got you. I've got you." But even as he says it, darkness creeps at the edges of his vision. How long has it been since the attack? Hours? Days? Time blurs together in this white hell. He forces himself to remember, forces himself to stay conscious through the rage that still burns in his chest. 3 days ago. Serafina had been beautiful as always, her silver hair catching the candlelight as she nursed their newborns. Theron had stood in the doorway of their chambers, heart swelling with pride and love as he watched his mate with their children. Triplets. The firstborn to their pack in over a century. "They're perfect," he'd whispered, crossing to kneel beside the bed. But Serafina hadn't met his eyes. "Theron, there's something we need to discuss." The way she'd said it, cold, formal, should have been his first warning. But he'd been drunk on new fatherhood, on the miracle of 3 healthy pups when so many werewolf births ended in tragedy. "The elders want to see you," she'd continued. "About the children." "What about them?" Finally, she'd looked at him. Her green eyes held no warmth, no love, only calculation. "The prophecy, Theron. Surely you remember the prophecy." His blood had turned to ice. Every werewolf knew the ancient words, when 3 are born as one, the old ways die and the new world comes. Death walks with them, and the pack shall fall, That's just superstition, he'd said, but his voice cracked on the words. Is it? Serafina had shifted the pups away from him when he reached for them. Look at them, Theron. Really look. He had looked. 3 perfect babies with tiny fingers and the softest fur he'd ever felt. His children. His legacy. They're cursed, she'd whispered. And you're unfit to lead while they live. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. Serafina. The decision has been made. Her voice was arctic. The pack elders are waiting. He should have run then. Should have taken his pups and disappeared into the night. Instead, he'd gone to face the council like the honorable fool he was. They'd been waiting for him, all 12 elders in their ceremonial robes, faces grave with manufactured sorrow. Elder Morrison had spoken for them all. Alpha King Theron Blackmane, you stand accused of bringing cursed blood into the pack. The triplets must be destroyed, and you must be removed from power for the safety of all. They're innocent children, Theron had roared, his wolf rising to the surface. My children. They are abominations, Morrison had replied coldly. And you are blind to the danger they pose. You are no longer fit to lead. The fight had been brutal but brief. 12 against 1, even an Alpha King, was no contest. They'd beaten him nearly to death in the sacred circle, his own mate watching from the shadows without lifting a finger to help. But they'd made one mistake, they'd assumed he was dead when they dragged him into the forest to let the elements finish what they'd started. He'd crawled back for his pups while the pack celebrated his death. Serafina had already moved into the Alpha quarters with her new mate, Morrison's son, Garrett. They'd left the triplets in the old nursery like discarded toys. Getting them out had cost him the last of his strength. Now, kneeling in the snow with his life bleeding out into the frozen ground, Theron knows he's dying. The wounds are too deep, the cold too fierce. His wolf whimpers inside him, growing weaker with each heartbeat. I'm sorry, he whispers to the bundles in his arms. I'm so sorry, little ones. He crawls toward an old oak tree, massive and ancient, its gnarled roots creating a small shelter from the wind. If he's going to die, at least he can try to keep them warm until the end. The bark scrapes his back as he settles against the trunk, pulling his jacket tighter around the pups. They've stopped crying now, which terrifies him more than their earlier wails. Silence means they're giving up. Like him. His head falls back against the rough bark, and he stares up at the star-scattered sky through the bare branches. So beautiful. Serafina used to love watching the stars with him, back when her smiles were real and her touch was gentle. Before ambition poisoned her heart. The wind dies down, and in the sudden quiet, Theron hears something that makes his dying wolf perk up its ears. Footsteps. Soft, hesitant, but definitely footsteps crunching through the snow. His hand instinctively moves to the silver knife at his belt, a useless gesture since he can barely lift his arm, but old habits die hard. The pack elders, come to finish what they started? But the scent on the wind is wrong. Not the musk of wolves, but something else. Something different. A small figure emerges from the shadows between the trees, and Theron's breath catches in his throat. A girl, maybe 16 or 17, with matted brown hair and clothes that have seen better years. She moves like prey, careful, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But she's not running from him. She's coming closer. Please don't hurt me, she whispers, her voice barely audible above the wind. I heard crying. Theron tries to speak, but only a harsh rasp emerges. The girl takes another step closer, and he can see her face now, thin from hunger, bruised, but alive with an fierce intelligence that reminds him of a cornered fox. Oh gods, she breathes, seeing the blood. You're dying. He manages a nod. Her eyes drop to the bundles in his arms, and her expression softens. Babies? Another nod. She looks around nervously, then back at him. The pack will kill me if they find me here. I'm not supposed to exist anymore. Theron's vision blurs, but he forces out one word, please. The girl, no, young woman, stares at him for a long moment. He can see the war playing out across her features. Fear battling compassion. Self-preservation against mercy. Finally, she steps forward and kneels in the snow beside him. My name is Lyra, she says softly. And I've got nowhere else to go anyway. Chapter 2. Lyra had seen dead men before, the forest was full of them. Rogues who pushed too far into pack territory, humans who stumbled into the wrong hunting grounds, wolves who challenged alphas beyond their station. But she'd never seen a dead man still breathing, still fighting to keep 3 tiny lives warm against his cooling chest. This is insane, she whispered to herself as she grabbed Theron under his arms, trying to lift him. Absolutely insane. He was massive even in his human form, easily 6.5 feet of solid muscle that felt like trying to move a mountain. His skin burned with fever while the rest of him grew cold, and the smell of blood and infection made her stomach turn. The pups mewled weakly from inside his jacket, and that tiny sound broke something inside her chest. Okay, she said, settling him back against the tree. Okay, think, Lyra. Think. She looked around frantically, then remembered the old wooden sled she'd found last winter. It was hidden in the deadfall about 50 yards east, close enough to drag here if she hurried. I'll be right back, she promised the dying Alpha King. Don't you dare die on me. Not when you've made it this far. She ran through the snow faster than any human should be able to move, her peculiar gifts lending speed to her steps. The sled was where she'd left it, half buried under fallen branches but intact. She hauled it free and raced back to find Theron exactly as she'd left him, unconscious but breathing, the pup still tucked safely against his chest. Getting him onto the sled took every ounce of strength she possessed and several angles that would have made a geometry teacher weep. But finally, she had the massive alpha secured with strips torn from her spare blanket, the triplets nestled in a makeshift nest beside him. The trek to her cave normally took 15 minutes. Dragging a sled through snow while checking constantly to make sure her passengers were still alive turned it into an hour-long nightmare. By the time she reached the hidden entrance, her lungs burned and her arms shook with exhaustion. But they'd made it. The cave was small but deep, carved into the hillside by some long-ago stream. She'd been living here for 3 years, ever since the pack had cast her out, and she'd made it as comfortable as possible. Thick furs covered the rocky floor, a fire pit provided warmth, and she'd even managed to rig a crude chimney that vented the smoke through a crack in the ceiling. More importantly, it was hidden. The entrance was concealed behind a tangle of thorn bushes that looked impenetrable from the outside. Not even the pack's best trackers had found her here. She dragged the sled inside and immediately set about building up the fire. Heat first, then she could assess the damage. In the flickering firelight, Theron looked even worse than she'd thought. The gashes across his ribs were deep and infected, probably from claws. His left shoulder hung at an odd angle, dislocated or broken. And those were just the injuries she could see. The pups were in better shape but growing weaker by the hour. They needed milk, warmth, and care she wasn't sure she could provide. "Well," she said to the unconscious Alpha, "you certainly know how to make an entrance." She started with the babies. Carefully extracting them from Theron's jacket, she examined each one by firelight. They were so small, so perfect, clearly born within the last few days. 2 were boys, 1 a girl, all of them with the fine bone structure that marked them as royal blood. But it was what she found on their tiny shoulders that made her blood run cold. Birthmarks. Not the usual brown or pink patches that sometimes decorated newborn skin, but marks that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. The first boy bore a crescent moon of pure silver. The second boy's mark was gold like captured sunlight. The girl's was deepest black, like a piece of night sky torn from the heavens. Lyra's hands trembled as she wrapped each pup in soft furs. She knew these marks. Every wolf-born child heard the old stories, the prophecies passed down through generations of pack mothers. The triad. 3 children born as one, marked by moon and sun and void, who would either save their kind or destroy it entirely. "Oh, little ones," she whispered. "No wonder they tried to kill you." The babies began to cry, thin, hungry wails that echoed off the cave walls. She needed milk, but where could she possibly find it? The nearest human settlement was 30 miles away, and she couldn't leave them long enough to make the journey. Unless... Lyra closed her eyes and reached deep inside herself, to the place where her gift lived. The power that had made her an outcast, marked her as dangerous, branded her as something to be feared. The ability to heal through touch had manifested when she was 12, during a particularly brutal training session. Another Omega girl had been savaged by an aggressive Beta, her throat nearly torn out. Lyra had touched the wound without thinking, desperate to help, and watched in amazement as flesh knitted together beneath her palms. The pack healer, an ancient woman named Mother Crow, had immediately declared her cursed. Healing magic in one so young, so untrained, it's unnatural. Dangerous. She'll drain the life from others to power her gift. It wasn't true, of course. The power came from within her, not from stealing life force. But fear was stronger than truth, and the pack had voted to cast her out rather than risk whatever catastrophe her gift might bring. Now, staring down at 3 dying babies, Lyra knew her exile had led to this moment. She touched her fingertips to her chest, just over her heart, and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. Then she cupped her hands and concentrated, feeling the familiar warmth build in her palms. It was a ridiculous idea. She'd never tried to create anything from nothing, only to heal what was broken. But the babies were crying, and their cries were growing weaker, and she had to try something. The warmth in her hands grew stronger, spreading up her arms and into her chest. She could feel her own life force responding, reshaping itself into something new. When she opened her palms, thick, creamy liquid pooled in her cupped hands. Milk. Rich, nourishing milk that smelled faintly of her own skin. It drained her, the effort left her dizzy and nauseated, but it was enough to feed 3 hungry babies. She fashioned feeding tools from clean leather strips and patiently coaxed each pup to drink. They latched on eagerly, their tiny hands grasping at her fingers as they fed. As they drank, their marks seemed to pulse gently with renewed light. Silver, gold, and black, the colors of prophecy made flesh. When the triplets finally settled into milk-drunk sleep, Lyra turned her attention to their father. Theron's fever had worsened while she tended the babies. He tossed restlessly on the furs, muttering words in the old language that made her skin prickle with recognition. She didn't understand all of it, but she caught enough. Names. Accusations. Pleas for forgiveness. Serafina, he whispered, the name torn from his throat like a curse. Why? Why betray everything we built? Lyra dampened a cloth with water from her small store and pressed it to his burning forehead. His skin was gray beneath the tan, his breathing shallow and rapid. Without intervention, he'd be dead before morning. But healing someone this badly injured would cost her. Maybe everything she had. She'd done it once before, when she was 15. A young wolf from a neighboring pack had been caught in an avalanche, his spine crushed, his skull fractured in 3 places. She'd healed him completely, and collapsed afterward, unconscious for 5 days. When she'd awakened, her hair had gone from rich brown to the mousy color it was now, and her eyes had faded from bright green to their current muddy hazel. The price of power, Mother Crow had called it. Every great healing took something from the healer. But looking at the Alpha King's gray face, at the 3 perfect babies sleeping nearby, Lyra knew she didn't have a choice. She placed her hands on Theron's chest, directly over the worst of the claw marks, and opened herself to the healing flow. It hit her like lightning. His injuries were severe, not just the obvious wounds, but internal bleeding, cracked ribs, a concussion that should have killed him hours ago. Her power reached into every damaged cell, every torn fiber, and began the slow work of reconstruction. The pain was incredible. Her gift worked by temporarily taking the injuries into herself, healing them within her own body, then transferring the restoration back to the patient. For long minutes, she felt like she was drowning in blood, felt her own ribs crack and heal, felt her skull throb with phantom pressure. But slowly, gradually, Theron's wounds began to close. The gashes across his ribs sealed themselves, leaving only pink lines that faded even as she watched. His breathing deepened, the gray pallor leaving his cheeks. His dislocated shoulder popped back into place with an audible crack. When she finally lifted her hands, he was sleeping peacefully. Truly sleeping, not the fitful unconsciousness of the dying. And Lyra felt like she'd been hit by a falling tree. She crawled to the far side of the cave before collapsing, too exhausted to even make it to her usual sleeping spot. Whatever the healing had cost her, she'd know when she woke up. If she woke up. As consciousness faded, she heard Theron begin to mutter again. But this time, his words were clearer, less fevered. "Father," he whispered. "I failed you. Failed them all." Lyra's eyes snapped open despite her exhaustion. Father? But the previous Alpha King had died 20 years ago. She should know, she'd been there when they burned his body, one more unwanted child standing at the edge of the crowd. One more unwanted child who shared his eyes. His jawline. His stubborn streak that had gotten them both cast out in their own ways. But that was impossible. She was nobody. An Omega without a past, without a pack, without even the ability to shift properly. Wasn't she? Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall through the cave's ventilation crack. Storm season was coming early this year, which meant they'd be trapped together for days. Maybe weeks. Long enough for secrets to surface. Long enough for truths she'd buried to claw their way back into the light. Lyra closed her eyes and tried not to think about the way Theron's face looked so familiar in sleep, or how his scent reminded her of summer afternoons in the old palace gardens before everything went wrong. Some doors were better left unopened. But as the storm settled in around them, as the 3 marked babies slept peacefully between their hidden world and the larger one that wanted them dead, Lyra had the sinking feeling that all her carefully locked doors were about to be kicked wide open. Whether she was ready or not. Chapter 3. Theron woke to the sound of rain drumming against stone and the unexpected sensation of being warm. Actually warm, not the bone-deep cold that had been his companion for days. He lay still for a moment, cataloging his body's condition with the methodical precision of a warrior. No pain. That was wrong, he should be screaming in agony from the wounds the elders had inflicted. Instead, he felt whole. Strong, even. Like he'd slept for a week instead of however long he'd been unconscious. Memory flooded back. The betrayal. The fight. Crawling through the snow with his children. And then. A girl. A young woman with frightened eyes and gentle hands. He opened his eyes and found himself staring at a rough stone ceiling. The cave was larger than it had seemed in his fevered memories, carved deep into the hillside and surprisingly well appointed. Furs covered the floor, supplies lined the walls in neat organization, and a small fire crackled cheerfully in a stone-lined pit. The triplets were sleeping peacefully in a nest of soft rabbit fur near the fire, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect synchronization. They looked healthy, better than healthy. Their skin had the rosy glow of well-fed babies, and someone had cleaned them and wrapped them in fresh cloth. "You're awake." Theron turned toward the voice and saw his rescuer sitting cross-legged near the cave entrance, carefully sharpening a hunting knife with practiced strokes. In the firelight, she looked older than he'd first thought, maybe 20 instead of 16, but there was still something almost ethereal about her features. High cheekbones, a delicate jaw, and those unusual hazel eyes that seemed to shift color with the light. "How long?" His voice came out as a croak. 3 days. She didn't look up from her blade. "The storm's been raging the whole time. We're snowed in pretty thoroughly." 3 days. 3 days during which his pack would have consolidated power, declared him officially dead, and begun the hunt for his children. 3 days during which this strange young woman had kept them all alive. He sat up carefully, testing his body's response. Everything worked perfectly, too perfectly. The deep gashes across his ribs were gone without even a scar. His dislocated shoulder moved freely. Even the concussion that should have addled his brain for weeks had completely healed. "You did this." It wasn't a question. Lyra's hands stilled on the whetstone. "Did what?" "Healed me. That's why they cast you out, isn't it? Not because you couldn't shift. Because you could do something they feared." She set down the knife and finally met his eyes. "The pack doesn't like things they can't understand. Or control." Theron studied her face, noting the way she held herself, straight back despite the casual pose, every muscle ready for flight. Like prey that had learned to survive in a world of predators. But there was steel underneath the fear, a core of strength that reminded him of someone. "What's your full name?" "Just Lyra. That's all I've ever been. Everyone has a family name. Even Omegas." Her laugh held no humor. "Not the ones nobody wanted." Before Theron could press further, one of the triplets began to fuss. Lyra was on her feet instantly, crossing to kneel beside the makeshift nest. She lifted the crying baby, his daughter, Theron realized, with the natural ease of someone who'd been caring for children all her life. "Hungry again," Lyra murmured, settling the baby in her lap. "They eat constantly." Theron watched in fascination as she cupped her hands and concentrated. Within moments, rich milk pooled in her palms, created from nothing but will and power. It should have been impossible. Healing was one thing, but creating sustenance from thin air. "That's not normal healing magic," he said quietly. "Nothing about me is normal." She fashioned a feeding implement from soft leather and began coaxing the baby to drink. "I've never met another healer who could do what I do." "Because you're not just a healer." The pieces were clicking together in Theron's mind, forming a picture that made his chest tighten with possibility. "How old are you, Lyra?" 23. "When's your birthday?" She hesitated. "I don't know the exact date." Sometime in late winter. 23 years ago. Late winter. Just months before his father had died in that hunting accident that had never quite made sense. The old Alpha King had been acting strangely in those final months, secretive, making trips away from pack lands without explanation. Your mother, Theron pressed. What do you remember about her? She died when I was born. Lyra's voice was flat, emotionless. That's all anyone ever told me. Who raised you? The pack orphanage until I was 12. Then various foster families who couldn't wait to get rid of the weird girl who made them uncomfortable. She looked down at the feeding baby, her expression softening. I've been on my own for over a decade. Theron felt something cold settle in his stomach. The timeline fit. The circumstances fit. And those eyes, now that he really looked at them, they were achingly familiar. Before he could voice his suspicions, a new sound cut through the steady drum of rain. Howling. Distant but unmistakable, and getting closer. Lyra's head snapped up, her nostrils flaring as she scented the air. Hunters. At least 6 of them. Theron was on his feet instantly, his wolf rising to the surface. How close? Half a mile, maybe less. They're following our scent trail from the oak tree. She carefully settled the baby back with her brothers, then moved to a collection of weapons hidden behind a hanging fir. We have maybe 10 minutes before they find the cave entrance. We run. Theron began gathering the babies. There has to be another way out of here. In this storm? With 3 newborns? Lyra shook her head. We'd freeze to death in an hour. This is the only shelter for miles. Then we fight. You fight. I hide with the babies. Theron caught her arm as she tried to move past him. You've kept us alive for 3 days. You don't get to martyr yourself now. I'm not a fighter. I can't even shift properly. Then I'll teach you. She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. In 10 minutes? Not to shift. To fight. He released her arm and moved to examine her weapons cache. You've been surviving alone for years. That takes skills most pack wolves never develop. The howling was getting closer. Theron selected a pair of curved daggers from Lyra's collection, testing their balance. Well maintained and sharp enough to shave with. I've watched you move, he continued. You're fast. Quiet. You think before you act. Those are advantages most alphas never learn because they're too busy relying on brute strength. I'm not a warrior. No. You're something better. You're a survivor. He pressed the daggers into her hands. And right now, that's exactly what we need. The sound of claws scrabbling on stone echoed from somewhere near the cave entrance. They were out of time. Theron shifted into his wolf form, a massive black beast with silver markings that marked him as royal blood. Even diminished by injury and exile, he was an impressive sight. But 6 against 1 weren't good odds, especially when he was protecting 4 others. Stay behind me, he growled, his voice carrying even in wolf form. Keep the babies safe. The first enemy wolf came through the entrance low and fast, expecting to find a wounded alpha and helpless babies. Instead, he met 200 pounds of angry werewolf king backed by righteous fury. Theron's jaws closed around the intruder's throat before the scout could even yelp. A quick shake, and the first threat was eliminated. But 5 more poured through the entrance immediately after, spreading out to surround him. He recognized 2 of them, Garrett's personal guards, chosen for loyalty to the new regime rather than skill. The largest of them, a brown wolf with battle scars across his muzzle, stepped forward. Even in wolf form, his voice carried clearly. Alpha King Theron Blackmane. By order of the Pack Council, you are sentenced to death for treason and harboring cursed blood. Funny, Theron replied, circling slowly. I don't remember acknowledging the authority of traitors. The brown wolf's lips pulled back in a snarl. Your mate sends her regards. Red rage flooded Theron's vision. He lunged forward with a roar that shook dust from the cave's ceiling, catching the brown wolf across the chest with claws extended. They rolled across the stone floor in a tangle of fur and fangs, each trying for a killing grip. The other 4 attackers moved to flank him, but suddenly Lyra was there, moving with impossible speed and grace, her daggers flashing in the firelight. She wasn't fighting like a wolf or even like a trained warrior. She was fighting like something wild and desperate, using every dirty trick and unconventional move in her arsenal. One of the scouts yelped as her blade opened a long gash across his ribs. Another stumbled back as she somehow managed to tangle his legs and send him crashing into the cave wall. But she was only human, and they were wolves. Sooner or later, her luck would run out. It happened when she overextended trying to protect the babies. A gray wolf she hadn't seen coming caught her across the back with his claws, sending her sprawling. Blood bloomed across her shirt as she hit the ground hard. The gray wolf loomed over her, jaws opening for the killing bite. And something inside Lyra snapped. The sound that came from her throat was nothing human, a wild, keening cry that made the stone walls ring. Power exploded outward from her prone form, washing over the cave in waves that made Theron's fur stand on end. When the light faded, a wolf stood where Lyra had fallen. But not just any wolf. A white wolf with fur like fresh snow and eyes like liquid silver, the mythical moon-blessed bloodline that had vanished from the world over a century ago. The gray wolf that had been about to kill her stumbled backward, whimpering. Even Theron felt the urge to bare his throat in submission. This wasn't just a shift, it was a manifestation of pure alpha power, the kind that existed only in legends. Lyra's silver eyes fixed on the gray wolf, and her lips pulled back to reveal fangs that seemed to glow with their own inner light. When she moved, it was with fluid grace that made even Theron's enhanced speed look clumsy. She took the gray wolf apart in seconds. The remaining scouts broke and ran, their courage evaporating in the face of something they didn't understand. But Theron barely noticed their retreat. He was staring at Lyra's wolf form, memories cascading through his mind like falling stones. The last moon blessed had been his great-great-grandmother, Queen Astria, who had united the scattered packs into one great nation. She'd had the same white fur, the same silver eyes, the same aura of power that made other wolves instinctively kneel. But the bloodline had died out when Queen Astria's only son was killed in the Great War. Or so everyone had believed. Lyra shifted back to human form, her clothes somehow intact despite the transformation. She swayed on her feet, clearly drained by the experience, but her eyes were blazing with newfound understanding. "Well," she said shakily. "That's new." Before Theron could respond, another figure appeared in the cave entrance. This one wasn't a scout, it was Elder Morrison himself, looking ancient and gnarled even in his wolf form. But his eyes held the malevolent intelligence that had orchestrated the coup against Theron. "So," Morrison said, shifting to human form. "The rumors are true. The lost bloodline lives." He looked impossibly old standing there in his ceremonial robes, but Theron could smell the power radiating from him. Morrison might be ancient, but he was still dangerous. "I should have killed you both when I had the chance," the elder continued conversationally. "But I wanted to see for myself. To confirm what the prophecy suggested." "What prophecies?" Lyra demanded. Morrison smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. "The full prophecy, child. The part we never told the pack. When 3 are born as one, the old ways die and the new world comes. Death walks with them, and the packs shall fall, unless the moon blessed rises to guide them home." Theron felt the world tilt sideways. "The triplets aren't cursed." "Oh, they are," Morrison said. "But not in the way we claimed. They're cursed to destroy the current order, my order. Because they're not just royal blood, are they? They're bound to her." He pointed at Lyra. "The moon blessed. Their destined protector and guide." Lyra staggered backward as if she'd been struck. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Morrison's eyes glittered with malice. "Why do you think your healing powers are so strong? Why do you think you were cast out at exactly the right time to find them? Why do you think you've survived alone all these years when any normal Omega would have died? The babies began to cry in their nest, and Lyra moved instinctively to comfort them. As soon as her hands touched the nearest child, all three settled immediately, their birthmarks, silver, gold, and black, pulsing gently with renewed light. You see? Morrison continued. They know you. They've always known you. Just as you've always known them. Theron's mind reeled as he tried to process the implications. If Lyra was moon-blessed, if she was who Morrison claimed, then everything about the coup, about the prophecy, about his exile made a different kind of sense. The pack would never accept it, he said slowly. A moon-blessed alpha would mean the end of the elder system. The end of your power. Exactly. Morrison began to circle them like a predator stalking prey. Which is why you all have to die. Tonight. Here. Before word of her true nature can spread. The old elder's form began to shift, but not into a normal wolf. His bones elongated, his muscles swelled, and his eyes blazed with unnatural fire. When the transformation completed, a monster stood before them, something that had once been wolf but had been twisted by dark magic into something far more dangerous. You're not just an elder, Lyra breathed. You're a shadow walker. Morrison's laugh was like breaking glass. I've lived for 3 centuries, child. Long enough to see the rise and fall of a dozen pack leaders. Long enough to know that power belongs to those strong enough to seize it. He lunged forward with impossible speed, claws extended and fangs dripping with venom. Theron barely managed to intercept him, the two massive forms crashing together with bone-jarring force. But Morrison was old, cunning, and enhanced by powers that no natural wolf possessed. Within moments, he had Theron pinned against the cave wall, claws digging deep into the Alpha King's throat. The new order dies tonight, Morrison hissed. Along with the last of the old blood. Lyra watched in horror as the life began to fade from Theron's eyes. The babies were crying again, their small voices echoing off the stone walls like a lament for futures that would never come to pass. And something inside her, something that had been sleeping for 23 years, finally awakened. The moon-blessed weren't just healers. They weren't just shifters. They were the balance between life and death, order and chaos, the old world and the new. And Morrison had just threatened everything she was destined to protect. Silver light exploded from Lyra's eyes as she stepped forward, no longer the frightened exile or the reluctant healer. For the first time in her life, she was exactly who she was meant to be. Let him go. Her voice carried power that made the cave walls tremble, and even Morrison's ancient strength faltered before it. The Shadow Walker turned to face her, his monstrous features twisting into something like respect. Finally, he whispered. The true moon blessed rises. Too bad you're 3 centuries too late to save anyone. The final battle was about to begin. Chapter 4. The silver light emanating from Lyra's eyes cast dancing shadows on the cave walls, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, nothing moved except the flickering flames and the gentle rise and fall of 3 sleeping babies. Morrison's monstrous form crouched over Theron's prone body, ancient claws still pressed against the Alpha King's throat. But even the Shadow Walker seemed frozen by the raw power radiating from the young woman who had just discovered her true heritage. You don't understand what you're awakening, child, Morrison said, his voice like grinding stone. The moon-blessed weren't just rulers. They were weapons. Created to bring balance, yes, but balance sometimes requires destruction. Lyra took another step forward, and the silver light intensified. I understand enough. You tried to murder innocent children. You betrayed your own pack. You've perverted everything the Wolf Nation once stood for. The Wolf Nation was dying. Morrison's roar shook dust from the ceiling. Weak alphas, diluted bloodlines, packs scattered and fighting amongst themselves. I've spent 3 centuries trying to forge us into something strong enough to survive what's coming. What's coming? But before Morrison could answer, the sound of howling filled the night, not the hunting calls of a few scouts, but the deep, coordinated howls of an army. Dozens of voices joined in harmony, growing closer with each passing second. Morrison's twisted features curved into a smile. She's here. Theron struggled to his feet, blood trickling from the wounds on his throat. Who's here? The one who orchestrated all of this. Morrison backed toward the cave entrance, his eyes never leaving Lyra. The one who needed you to fall, needed the children to be born, needed the moon blessed to awaken. My true alpha. The howling stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of boots on stone. Multiple sets, moving with military precision through the cave passages. Whoever was coming had found another entrance, or made one. Theron moved to stand between Lyra and the approaching threat, but she caught his arm. No, she said quietly. This time, we face it together. The first figure to emerge from the shadows was achingly familiar. Seraphina stepped into the firelight with the fluid grace of a born predator, her silver hair braided for battle and her green eyes cold as winter ice. She wore the ceremonial armor of an alpha queen, but the symbols etched into the metal weren't from Theron's pack. They were older, darker, speaking of powers that had no place in the modern world. Behind her came 24 warriors, all bearing the same corrupted symbols. Their eyes held the glassy sheen of wolves bound by blood magic rather than loyalty. Hello, Theron, Seraphina said, her voice carrying the same warmth that had once made him believe she loved him. You look well. Amazing what proper healing can accomplish. Seraphina. Theron's voice was carefully controlled, but Lyra could feel the rage radiating from him like heat from a forge. I should have known you were behind Morrison's rebellion. Rebellion? Seraphina laughed, and the sound was like breaking crystal. Oh, my dear fool. Morrison didn't rebel against anything. He's been serving me for decades. The ancient shadow walker bowed his monstrous head. My alpha. The moon blessed has awakened, as you predicted. I can see that. Seraphina's gaze fixed on Lyra, and something predatory flickered in her green eyes. Though she's not quite what I expected. So young. So untrained. What do you want? Lyra demanded. What I've always wanted. What I've spent the last 3 years carefully orchestrating. Seraphina gestured to her warriors, who spread out to block every possible escape route. I want you to unlock your full power, moon-blessed. And I want those children to help you do it. Theron stepped forward, his wolf rising to the surface. You'll have to go through me first. Will I? Seraphina tilted her head, studying him like an interesting specimen. You still don't understand, do you? This was never about overthrowing you, Theron. It was about making you exactly where I needed you to be. Explain. The prophecy speaks of 3 children born as one, and the moon blessed who will guide them. But it doesn't specify that the moon blessed must be willing. Seraphina's smile turned razor-sharp. Dark magic is so much stronger when it's forged in betrayal and desperation. Ice formed in Lyra's stomach. You want to corrupt the prophecy. I want to fulfill it, but on my terms. You see, there's another part of the legend that the pack historians conveniently forgot to preserve. The moon-blessed weren't just protectors. They were keys. Specifically, keys to unlock the eternal curse. Morrison nodded eagerly. The curse that grants immortality and unlimited power to those strong enough to claim it. But, Seraphina continued, the curse can only be broken by willing sacrifice. The moon-blessed must choose to give up their power, their life force, their very essence to fuel the transformation. And they must do it while bonded to their 3 guardians. Theron's face went gray as understanding dawned. The triplets aren't just marked by prophecy. They're bound to her. From the moment of their birth, yes. Their life force is connected to hers, just as hers is connected to mine. Seraphina's eyes glittered with triumph. I've been preparing for this moment since before they were conceived. Every betrayal, every exile, every desperate choice that brought us to this cave, all of it orchestrated to create the perfect conditions. You're insane, Lyra whispered. I'm practical. The wolf nation is fragmenting. Human populations are encroaching on our territory. Other supernatural factions are growing stronger while we grow weaker. In 50 years, maybe less, our entire species will be extinct unless someone has the power to unite and protect us. By enslaving them to your will? By giving them a leader strong enough to ensure their survival. Seraphina raised her hand, and dark energy began to swirl around her fingers. I'll be immortal, all-powerful, and completely devoted to preserving our kind. What could be better? Freedom, Theron said quietly. Choice. The right to forge our own destiny. Pretty words from someone who's about to watch his children die. The battle erupted without warning. Seraphina's warriors rushed forward while she began chanting in the old language, her voice weaving threads of dark magic that made the air itself seem to thicken and burn. But this time, Theron didn't fight like a king defending his throne. He fought like everything Lyra had taught him, using speed instead of strength, strategy instead of brute force. He flowed between his enemies like smoke, striking at weak points and vulnerable joints, turning their own momentum against them. Lyra joined the battle not as a frightened exile, but as the moon-blessed awakening to her true nature. Silver light streamed from her hands as she moved, and every enemy she touched crumpled as their life force was temporarily disrupted. She wasn't trying to kill, she was trying to incapacitate long enough to reach the source of the threat. But Seraphina's magic was strong, and more warriors kept pouring through the cave entrances. For every enemy they dropped, 2 more appeared. Then the triplets began to cry. Not the normal wails of frightened babies, but something else entirely. Their voices rose in perfect harmony, and with each note, the birthmarks on their tiny shoulders blazed brighter. Silver, gold, and black light filled the cave, and suddenly an invisible barrier sprang into existence around Lyra. The enemy warriors stumbled backward as if they'd run into a wall. Even Morrison's shadow-enhanced strength couldn't penetrate whatever the babies had created. Impossible, Seraphina breathed. They're barely a week old. But Lyra understood. The triplets weren't just her destined guardians, they were her anchors. As long as they lived, as long as they chose to protect her, she couldn't be corrupted or controlled. Which meant Seraphina would have to kill them to claim her prize. No, Lyra said, reading the decision in the other woman's eyes. I won't let you hurt them. Then give me what I want willingly. Seraphina's form began to shift, but not into a normal wolf. Dark magic swirled around her, transforming her into something that might have been beautiful if it weren't so obviously wrong. Her wolf form was larger than any natural animal, with fur like spilled shadow and eyes that burned with stolen fire. Become my sacrifice, moon-blessed, and the children live. Refuse, and I'll tear them apart while you watch. Lyra looked at the 3 babies, at Theron who was bleeding from a dozen wounds as he held off the remaining warriors, at Morrison whose ancient power was slowly overwhelming her protective barrier. She could feel her own power growing stronger with each heartbeat, fed by desperation and love and the absolute determination to protect what mattered most. But Seraphina was right, she was untrained, uncertain, fighting on instinct rather than knowledge. It might not be enough. Unless. I'll make the sacrifice, Lyra said, stepping forward. But I choose the terms. You're in no position to negotiate. Aren't I? Lyra raised her hands, and silver light blazed between her fingers. I'm the moon blessed. The prophecy specifically states that my power must be given willingly. Try to take it by force, and you'll get nothing but empty magic that will burn you from the inside out. Seraphina hesitated, clearly weighing the truth of those words. What do you propose? Single combat. You and me, winner takes all. If you defeat me, I'll transfer my power willingly and completely. If I win, you release your hold over Morrison and the warriors, and you leave the children alone. And if I simply kill you instead? Then the power dies with me, and you get nothing. Lyra smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt completely certain of her choice. The moon-blessed magic doesn't transfer through death, Seraphina. It has to be a willing gift, or it's worthless. Behind them, the triplets' crying had evolved into something else, a low, musical humming that seemed to resonate through the stone itself. Their protective barrier was growing stronger, expanding to encompass Theron as well. Seraphina snarled her frustration. Fine. Single combat. But when I win, you'll give me everything. When you win, Lyra agreed. The two women circled each other in the center of the cave while their respective allies stepped back to give them room. This was between them now, light versus darkness, sacrifice versus selfish ambition, the future of the wolf nation hanging in the balance. Seraphina struck first, moving with inhuman speed to rake her claws across Lyra's chest. But the moon-blessed was no longer the frightened exile who had rescued a dying alpha from the snow. She was something older, something that remembered battles fought before human civilization existed. She caught Seraphina's wrist in mid-strike and channeled pure healing energy directly into the dark wolf's nervous system. Not to harm, but to restore, to burn away the corruption that had twisted Seraphina's natural wolf form into this abomination. Seraphina screamed as golden light raced through her body, but when it faded, she was still standing. Still enhanced by stolen power. Did you really think it would be that simple? She laughed. I've been preparing for this confrontation for years. Your little healing tricks won't work on willing corruption. She lunged again, and this time her claws found their mark. Pain exploded across Lyra's ribs as she stumbled backward, her own blood joining the stains on the cave floor. But the injury cleared her head, focusing her power with laser intensity. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for Theron, for the triplets, for every wolf who deserved to choose their own destiny. Silver light exploded from her hands as she struck back, not with healing energy this time, but with pure creative force. The power that could make milk from nothing, that could knit wounds that should have been fatal, that could break curses forged in darkness and despair. The blast caught Seraphina full in the chest, sending her flying across the cave to crash into the stone wall. When she struggled to her feet, her dark enhancement was flickering like a dying candle. This isn't over, she gasped. Even if you defeat me here, there are others. Other packs who will want to control or destroy what you represent. Then we'll face them together, Theron said, moving to stand beside Lyra. As true mates. As equal partners. Something shifted in the air between them, a bond snapping into place that felt as natural as breathing. Lyra could suddenly feel Theron's thoughts, his emotions, his absolute determination to build something better than what they'd lost. And through that bond, power flowed. Not the corrupted magic Seraphina had been seeking, but something clean and pure and infinitely stronger. The final blast of silver light filled the entire cave, washing over everyone present with the irresistible force of a tsunami. When it faded, Seraphina lay unconscious against the far wall, her corrupt enhancement completely burned away. Morrison had reverted to his normal elderly human form, blinking in confusion as if waking from a long dream. The bound warriors shook their heads and looked around like men seeing clearly for the first time in months. Is it over? One of them asked. Lyra sagged against Theron, exhausted but victorious. For now. 3 months later, Lyra stood on the balcony of the restored royal palace, watching the sun set over pack lands that were finally at peace. The triplets played in the snow below, already showing signs of their emerging abilities, small bursts of colored light that danced around them like fireflies. Theron emerged from the palace behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. The council meeting went well. 7 more packs have agreed to join the new alliance. And the others? Still deciding. But they're talking instead of fighting, which is progress. Lyra leaned back against his chest, marveling at how right it felt. They'd been mated for barely 2 months, but it seemed like they'd been together forever. Any word on Seraphina? She's alive, but changed. The healers say the corruption is completely gone, but so is most of her memory. She doesn't remember the curse, the conspiracy, any of it. Do you think she's truly free, or just biding her time? Theron was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. But we'll be ready either way. Below them, the triplets had discovered that their combined power could make flowers bloom in the snow. They giggled with delight as tiny spring blossoms pushed through the frozen ground, their birthmarks glowing softly in the twilight. They're going to be something extraordinary, Lyra murmured. They already are. Just like their mother. As if responding to their voices, the babies looked up and waved their tiny hands. Light streamed from their fingers, silver, gold, and black weaving together into patterns that spoke of hope, growth, and unlimited possibility. When the full moon rose over the palace, Lyra and Theron shifted together, she into her white wolf form with eyes like liquid silver, he into his black wolf with royal markings. They ran through the snow with their children, no longer refugees or exiles, but the foundation of something entirely new. The old ways hadn't died, as the prophecy had warned. They had simply evolved, guided by wisdom instead of tradition, by love instead of fear. And under the light of the moon that had blessed them all, the future stretched ahead like an unmarked path through pristine snow, full of challenges, certainly, but also full of endless possibility. The wolf nation would endure. But more than that, it would thrive. And it would choose its own destiny. Epilogue. 5 years later. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the palace nursery, casting rainbow patterns across the polished wooden floor where 3 children played with the focused intensity that only 5-year-olds could muster. Their laughter filled the room, pure, infectious joy that made everyone who heard it smile involuntarily. Lyra stood in the doorway, one hand resting on her rounded belly, watching her children with the same wonder she'd felt the first time she'd held them as helpless newborns. So much had changed since that terrible night in the cave. So much had grown from the ashes of what they'd lost. "Mama, look," called Kieran, the eldest by mere minutes but already showing signs of the natural leadership that ran in his father's bloodline. His silver birthmark glowed softly as he concentrated, carefully levitating a wooden toy wolf 3 feet off the ground. "I can make it dance." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Lyra said, settling into the comfortable rocking chair Theron had carved for her during her first pregnancy. "But remember what we talked about, using your gifts responsibly." "Only to help, never to hurt," chanted Mira, their daughter, whose golden mark seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. She was gentler than her brothers, more thoughtful, but her power was just as strong. As she spoke, every flower in the room's garden boxes began to bloom simultaneously, filling the air with the sweet scent of spring. "And only when it feels right in here," added Sage, the youngest, pointing to his chest. His black birthmark was the most subtle of the 3, but Lyra had learned it was also the most complex. Where Kieran could manipulate physical objects and Mira could encourage growth and healing, Sage seemed able to sense emotions and intentions, a gift that would serve him well in the diplomatic future that likely awaited him. "Very good." Lyra's voice was soft with pride. "Now, who wants to help me with the morning rounds?" All 3 hands shot up immediately. The morning rounds had become a beloved family tradition, walking through the palace and the surrounding village, checking on the people, listening to their concerns, offering help where it was needed. It was Lyra's way of staying connected to the individuals behind all the grand politics of ruling, and it had proven to be one of the most popular innovations of the new regime. "Can we visit Master Chin in the smithy?" Kieran asked hopefully. "He said he might have my sword ready today." Lyra bit back a smile. At 5 years old, Kieran was already fascinated by the weapons and warrior training that were part of his heritage. Theron had commissioned a child-sized practice sword from the master smith, blunted and weighted for safety, but real enough to make the boy feel grown up. "We can stop by the smithy," she agreed. "But first, we need to check on the new families from the Northern Pack." The Northern Pack had been the latest to join their alliance, bringing with them refugees from territories that had been devastated by human encroachment. Integrating new pack members was always delicate work, requiring patience and careful attention to individual needs. "Are they the ones with the little baby?" Mira asked, her eyes lighting up. "The one who cries a lot?" "Yes, little Luna. Her parents are having trouble adjusting to our climate. Sometimes babies cry more when they're uncomfortable." "I could help." Mira jumped up eagerly. "I made Mrs. Henderson's flowers grow better when she was sad about her husband. Maybe I could make Luna feel better too." Lyra felt that familiar swell of maternal pride mixed with protective concern. Her children's gifts were growing stronger every day, but they were still so young, still learning to understand the responsibility that came with their abilities. We'll see, sweetheart. But remember, sometimes the best help is just being kind and friendly. Powers aren't always the answer. Before the children could respond, the sound of boots in the hallway announced Theron's arrival. He appeared in the doorway still dressed in his training clothes, his dark hair damp with sweat and his face glowing with the satisfaction of a good morning workout. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, crossing to kiss Lyra's forehead before kneeling to gather all three children in a massive bear hug. "And good morning, troublemakers. I heard someone was making toys dance without permission." "It was just a little dancing," Kieran protested, though his grin suggested he knew exactly how much mischief he'd been causing. "Aha." Theron's expression was stern, but his eyes danced with amusement. "And what does the rule say about using our gifts in public spaces?" "Ask permission first," all three children chorused. "That's right. Now, who wants to come help me review the morning reports? I hear there's some very important news from the Eastern Territories." "What kind of news?" Sage asked, his empathic abilities probably picking up on the excitement Theron was trying to hide. "The kind that means we might have some very special visitors soon." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "Visitors?" Theron's smile widened. "Alpha Marcus from the Eastern Pack sent word this morning. They've not only agreed to join the Alliance, they're requesting a formal unity ceremony. Here. Next month." The implications hit Lyra immediately. The Eastern Pack was the largest of the remaining independent groups, controlling territory that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast. Their alliance would bring the total number of unified packs to 23, making their confederation the largest peaceful wolf nation in recorded history. "That's wonderful news," she said, though her mind was already spinning with the logistics of hosting such a significant event. "There's more." Theron settled on the floor next to her chair, automatically opening his arms as Sage climbed into his lap. "Marcus specifically mentioned wanting his grandchildren to meet ours. Apparently, he's heard stories about their abilities and wants to explore the possibility of establishing formal diplomatic and educational exchanges." Lyra's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The baby, their fourth, was due in the early fall, and she'd already been wondering how to balance another child with the increasingly complex demands of their growing nation. "Educational exchanges?" Kieran perked up with interest. "Like school?" "More like learning from other young wolves with special abilities," Theron explained. "The Eastern Pack has several children who've manifested unusual gifts. Nothing like yours, but strong enough that they need specialized guidance." "Could we teach them?" Mira asked shyly. Despite her gentle nature, she'd shown a remarkable talent for instructing other children in the basics of power control. "We'll see, little star. First, we need to meet them and see if everyone gets along." The family spent the next hour discussing the upcoming visit while getting ready for their morning rounds. It was one of Lyra's favorite times of day, the casual, domestic moments when they were just parents and children rather than the moon-blessed royal family carrying the hopes of an entire species. Their first stop was indeed the Northern Pack settlement, a collection of comfortable cabins built in the meadow below the main palace. The integration had been going well overall, but there were always small challenges to address. They found Luna's parents, Eric and Stella, looking exhausted but grateful as Lyra knocked on their door. The baby was sleeping peacefully in her father's arms, but the dark circles under both parents' eyes told the story of many sleepless nights. "Your Majesty," Stella began, but Lyra waved away the formal address. "Please, just Lyra. We're neighbors now." She gestured to her children, who had arranged themselves in a neat line behind her. "These are my little helpers. We wanted to check how you're settling in." "Everyone's been so welcoming," Eric said, shifting Luna to his other arm. "It's just, she seems to cry more here than she did back home. We're wondering if maybe something about the altitude or the air is bothering her." Mira stepped forward, her expression serious with 5-year-old concentration. "May I listen to her heart? Sometimes babies cry when they're lonely for home." Lyra started to intervene. Myra's abilities were still developing, and she worried about the child attempting healing work beyond her current skill level. But something in her daughter's eyes stopped her. This felt right. This felt like exactly what Mira was meant to do. If her parents don't mind, Lyra said carefully. Eric and Stella exchanged glances, then Eric knelt down to bring Luna closer to Myra's level. What do you need to do? Just listen, Mira said softly, placing one small hand very gently on the baby's chest. Her golden birthmark began to glow, but softly, warmly, like candlelight rather than the blazing power she displayed during moments of crisis. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Luna's eyes opened, bright blue and alert, and she gurgled happily, reaching out with tiny fingers to grab Myra's hair. She says she misses the sound of the big river from home, Mira announced. It helped her sleep. She doesn't understand why it's so quiet here. Stella gasped. There was a waterfall near our old den. Luna always slept better when we were close to it. That's an easy fix, Theron said, kneeling down beside his daughter. There's a beautiful stream that runs behind the settlement. We can move your cabin closer to it if you'd like. Or, Kieran added helpfully, I could practice my water moving with the stream. Make it sound bigger and more like home. That's very generous, Eric said, his voice thick with emotion. But you don't need to go to so much trouble for us. It's not trouble, Lyra said firmly. It's family. That's what we do for family. The rest of their rounds went equally well. They visited the school where young wolves from different packs learned alongside each other, something that had been unheard of just 5 years earlier. They stopped by the new hospital where human and supernatural medicine worked together to provide the best possible care. They checked on the community gardens where every family could grow their own food, regardless of their pack status or ability to contribute financially. At each stop, Lyra marveled at how much had changed. The rigid hierarchies that had once defined pack life were dissolving into something more flexible, more inclusive. Alphas still led, but they led through consensus rather than dominance. Omegas were valued for their unique gifts rather than dismissed as lesser. Children were encouraged to develop their abilities for the benefit of everyone rather than being forced into predetermined roles. It wasn't perfect, change never was. There were still those who resented the new ways, still packs that refused to join the alliance, still challenges that seemed insurmountable on some days. But it was progress. It was hope. It was everything Lyra had dreamed of during those lonely years as an exile. Their final stop was the Memorial Garden, a peaceful space dedicated to those who had died during the transition to the new order. Theron's father's grave was there, along with markers for the wolves who had fallen during various conflicts, and even a small stone commemorating Seraphina, not the corrupted woman who had tried to destroy them, but the young wolf she had been before darkness claimed her. Tell us about great-grandfather again, Sage requested as they stood before the elaborate headstone that marked the previous Alpha King's resting place. It had become a ritual, these stories. Theron would tell the children about their grandfather's wisdom, his dedication to protecting his people, his vision of a united wolf nation that had ultimately cost him his life. Lyra would add her own memories, fragments really, since she'd been so young when he died, of a man who had been kind to a strange little girl that no one else wanted. But today, as Theron began the familiar tale, Lyra found herself thinking not about the past but about the future. About the baby growing inside her, about the diplomatic challenges that lay ahead, about the kind of world they were building for their children and their children's children. Mama? Mira tugged on her dress. You look far away. Just thinking, sweetheart. About what? Lyra smiled, lifting her daughter into her arms despite the growing weight of her pregnancy. About how proud your great-grandfather would be of all of you. About how proud I am of all of you. Even when we're troublemakers? Kieran asked with a grin. Especially then. She reached out to ruffle his dark hair. Some of the best changes in the world started with people who refused to follow the old rules. As if summoned by her words, a messenger arrived at the garden gates, a young wolf from the communication corps that had been established to keep the various alliance packs in contact. He approached respectfully, bowing to both Theron and Lyra before delivering his news. Your Majesties, urgent word from the Southern Territories. Alpha Isabella reports that 3 more packs have requested Alliance membership, and... He paused, clearly excited. They're specifically asking for educational programs for their gifted children. Word of your children's abilities has spread, and they want their young ones to learn from the royal family. Theron and Lyra exchanged glances. This was exactly what they'd hoped for, not just political alliance, but cultural exchange, the sharing of knowledge and abilities that would make everyone stronger. How many children are we talking about? Lyra asked. 17, Your Majesty. Ranging in age from 4 to 16. All showing various forms of enhanced abilities. 17. Added to the children from the Eastern Pack, they were looking at establishing a formal school for gifted young wolves. It was an enormous undertaking, but also an incredible opportunity. We'll need to discuss this with the council, Theron said. But tell Alpha Isabella that we're very interested. We'll send a formal response within the week. As the messenger departed, Kieran tugged on his father's sleeve. Does this mean we're going to have lots of friends coming to visit? It looks that way. Good, Mira said decisively. I like having friends. And they can help us with the new baby when it comes. Lyra laughed, touched by her daughter's practical approach to expanding family. I think the new baby would like that very much. They walked back to the palace as the sun reached its zenith, painting the mountains in shades of gold and green that seemed to promise endless possibilities. The children ran ahead, their laughter echoing off the stone walls, while Theron and Lyra followed at a more sedate pace that accommodated her pregnancy and their need to simply enjoy this moment of peace. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently? Lyra asked as they paused at the palace steps. If Morrison and Seraphina had succeeded? If we hadn't found each other that night in the cave? Theron was quiet for a long moment, considering. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I look at our children, at what we've built, at the future that's spreading out in front of us, and I realize that everything had to happen exactly the way it did. All of it, the betrayal, the exile, the pain, it was all necessary to bring us to this moment. Even Seraphina? They'd had this conversation before, but it was one that seemed to require periodic revisiting. Seraphina was alive, living quietly in a small cottage near the eastern borders under a new name and with no memory of her previous life. The healers had determined that the destruction of her corrupted power had wiped away decades of memories, leaving her essentially as she had been as a young woman, before ambition and dark magic had twisted her into something unrecognizable. Theron had struggled with what to do about her. Justice demanded some form of punishment, but how could you punish someone who genuinely didn't remember their crimes? In the end, they'd settled on supervised exile. She was free to live her life, but under constant but discreet observation to ensure she posed no future threat. Even Seraphina, Theron said finally. She made her choices, and she paid the price for them. But without her betrayal, I never would have been desperate enough to flee into the forest with newborn babies. I never would have collapsed under that oak tree. I never would have met the most extraordinary woman in the world. He pulled Lyra into his arms, careful of her belly, and kissed her with the same passion and tenderness he'd shown every day since they discovered their mate bond. After 5 years of marriage and 3, soon to be 4, children, he still looked at her like she was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. I love you, he murmured against her lips. I love our chaos and our peace, our children and our calling, our past and our future. All of it. I love you too, she whispered back. More than I ever thought possible. A crash from inside the palace, followed by nervous laughter and rapidly approaching footsteps, interrupted their romantic moment. Oh, came Kieran's voice from just inside the doors. We should probably mention that we might have accidentally turned Uncle Marcus's new hat into a butterfly. And the butterfly might have gotten loose in the throne room. Added Mira helpfully. But it's a really pretty butterfly. Sage chimed in. Purple and gold, and it sparkles when it flies. Theron sighed, but his eyes danced with amusement. Duty calls, my love. It always does, Lyra agreed, taking his hand as they prepared to go deal with whatever magical mishap their children had created now. But I wouldn't have it any other way. As they walked through the palace doors together, Lyra felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs, a tiny reminder of the new life growing within her, of the continuing cycle of hope and love and possibility that defined their family. Outside, spring was finally asserting itself over the mountain winter. Flowers were blooming in impossible profusion, birds were building nests in the eaves of the palace, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of children laughing as they played in the gardens. The wolf nation had not just survived, it was thriving. And at the heart of it all was something that no prophecy could have predicted, no magic could have created, no amount of political maneuvering could have achieved. Love. Pure, simple, complicated, messy, wonderful love. The kind of love that built families and kingdoms, that healed old wounds and opened new possibilities, that turned exiled refugees into the foundation of a better world. And as Lyra followed her mate and children into their home, their palace, their sanctuary, their center of an ever-expanding circle of hope, she knew with absolute certainty that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them. After all, they had a nation to nurture, children to raise, and a future to build. Together. The end. Thank you for listening to this story. Like, share and subscribe for more.